here's the crazy part. The seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes are chemically and physically designed to withstand our digestive tract, and in some cases will not even germinate until they've gone through the digestive tract of a mammal, right? In certain cases. But what do? We actually take these seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes that are physically and chemically designed to withstand our digestive tract and try to get nutrition from it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literally what a loaf of bread is, right?
Yeah.
And that's what a nut is. And if we're going to do that, we have to do things to it. So the outside of the grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes are often the most toxic part. And it's there because, again, it's resisting disease and it's laying dormant and all these things until it's in the right environment to create new life.
Mm-hmm.
The very things that are protecting the seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes have to get shut off, many of them, for that plant to sprout, right? So one of the ways to help detoxify or deal with a lot of the toxins or problems with grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes is to trick it into thinking it's in that environment to support new life. So things like soaking and sprouting and fermenting are great ways of mitigating a lot of the issues with the toxins that are on the outside and sometimes on the inside of those grains as well.
Well, thank you so much, Bill Schindler, for joining me on this podcast. This is really such a pleasure for me to have you here and to speak to you about what you do and what you're up to these days and just your philosophies on food. So this is really such a pleasure for me. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you today? How are things this morning with you?
Good, and it is a pleasure for me as well. I love to talk about these things and share this information. So thank you for having me on.
Lovely. So what I wanted to basically kind of admit, first of all, kind of get stuck in is I am a bit late to the party when it comes to you and when it comes to what you do, because I have to admit, it was only up until a couple of months ago when a friend mentioned your name. He's like, I can see the podcast that you're doing. I can see that you're kind of looking at the Westday Prize Foundation. You're looking at, Natasha Campbell-Bride. And he said, look, Bill Schindler, you need to look him up. So I was literally only a couple of months ago. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to check him out then. And when I came across your stuff, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is right up my alley. This is really where I'm at right now with myself, my podcast. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to talk to you. And then I was reading your book and I was looking at your YouTube videos. So it's been really, really fun getting stuck into what you do and kind of learning from you, which has been awesome.
Well, thank you. And I'll before we even really dive deep, I do want to say I absolutely love the Weston Price Foundation, all that work. Actually, so everyone knows as well, the Weston Price Foundation, there's another foundation called the Price Pottinger Foundation, which is it's they do the same thing, but in slightly different ways. And Price Pottinger Foundation is actually they own all of Price's work and Pottinger's work and a lot of other doctors from those time periods. And there's great benefits from being a part of both organizations. And I'll also say that, this is coming from somebody, I just turned 50 myself, and we have 3 kids that are now teenagers. One's in college, 19, 17, and 15 now. My entire life, I was trying to find a way to feed myself and lose weight and be healthy and all these sorts of things. But it went into overdrive when I started having kids. I got married and started having kids and realizing that now I was responsible for nourishing other people that I loved. It became even more important. And, I started from this, I started to really get great information for the first time in my life through the Weston Price Foundation and the work of Weston Price. And every now and then I would go off on these tangents. My wife and I both, we would go full carnivore and we'd go full keto and we do all these other things. And there are amazing benefits to all of them. But I will tell you, from a spouse, a father, somebody now who owns a restaurant with my family that we nourish in the community, that approach to, whole, real, amazing foods, familiar foods, just done in the most nourishing way possible, is what I believe the most sustainable way to approach food. You can do some of these things for shorter periods of time, and sometimes it makes really good sense to do some of these other sort of more extreme approaches to solve certain problems or to get certain results. But a long-term solution, I think, is, we're in that space right now.
Absolutely. And I totally relate, because I've also been kind of flipping between diets. I'm like, okay, so what do I think about keto? What do I think about paleo? What do I think about all of these different types of ways of eating, which, like you said, they have amazing benefits. Like, I've never felt comfortable heavily promoting one, but not trashing any of them either, because what works for one person won't work for another. So keto might be amazing for one, and paleo might be amazing for another, and vice versa. But I know what you mean. When I started looking up the Western Aid Prize Foundation, which was, gosh, this was like over a decade ago, it really draws you in, and I was so interested. But then I sort of lost touch with it over time. But then it's only recently when I've kind of that the fire has been relit, and I'm just like, wow, they stand for really amazing things, and I feel like there's truth there in what they say and what they speak of. And when I came across your YouTube videos, actually, it's what your philosophy is basically. It's not what you eat, it's how you eat. Now, that is really prominent, and that's a really important thing about how you do things. And it's a really important thing that the audience needs to know. It's not what you eat, it's how you eat. So can you speak a little bit on that, just before we go into your story and before we go into everything, just as an intro? Like, can you speak on that bit just a little bit?
Okay, so the first of all, I think my approach to food, health, diet, all of it is solely founded on exactly what you just said. The idea that for humans, and this isn't for deer out in the woods or squirrels, or for humans, it is more important to understand. It is just as important, if not more important, to understand and pay attention to how we eat, not just what we eat. And the problem is that almost all of the discussions around diet and health today, and have been, for decades, is just about what. Okay, you're going to eat avocados, or you're not going to eat meat, or you're going to eat eggs, or you're going to eat egg yolk. It's always about
so
the
confusing.
what.
Yes.
It's so confusing, and we get caught in this. And I used to think my whole life, okay, if somebody would just tell me what I need to eat, I can be healthy. And there are things we should never eat, and there's things we should always eat, absolutely. But the difference for humans, and this is the part where, and we'll dive into my story and some of that in a few minutes, like you mentioned, but the part that's so empowering to understand, but the part that we're missing, is that we have one of the least, if not the least, efficient digestive tract of any animal on the planet. And at the same time, even though we're burdened with this incredibly inefficient digestive tract, we have these incredibly large bodies for that size digestive tract, and more importantly, this incredibly large brains, the most nutrient-needy organ in our body, that not only needs a massive amount of calories, but it needs the right kind of nutrition, high-quality fats, those sorts of things. So if we come from the perspective, so everybody listening, if you could just for a minute, or for the rest of this conversation, just imagine a world in which we are completely biologically ill-equipped to nourish the bodies that we're inhabiting. And that's the reality. Our guts are too small, our teeth are too small, we're not strong enough, we can't fly, we can't dig into we can't do any of those things that allow us to get the nutrition to our mouths. And most importantly, when we put the nutrition in our mouths, we don't very efficiently digest it properly to get all those nutrients where they need to be. And that means what we need to do to nourish ourselves properly. And when I say nourish ourselves properly, I mean, number one, make sure our food is as safe as it can possibly be. And I don't mean safe from pathogens, even though that's important, but I mean safe from things like plant toxins, for example. So as safe as it can possibly be, as nutrient dense as it can possibly be. So in other words, it has all the nutrients that we actually need. And most importantly for humans, it needs to be bioavailable. So even though the food has nutrients in it, we need to be able to make use of them when it goes into our mouths. The only way that we can possibly do that is through the use of technology, processing our food in good ways to make it safer, more nutrient dense, and more bioavailable. The crazy thing is we've been doing some level of this for millions of years, getting better at it over time. We're worse at it now in the world, but for millions of years, we increasingly got better at it. And what we saw is, as we increasingly got better at developing and using technologies to extract the most incredible nutrition from the world around us, our bodies and our brains grew on the backs of that nutrition. Right? Incredible nutritional input in the right way going into our mouths, and then all of a sudden our bodies and our brains, literally transformed into what we have today.
Yeah.
But we're left at a point where, okay, we have these incredibly nutrient needy bodies and brains, and we're not taking in the same kind of nutrition that we used to. And even when we are taking in the same foods, we're not taking them in the same way that we used to in order to make them as nourishing as they can be.
I mean, what I find so mind-blowing really is the thought that, okay, so our digestive systems and our bodies, they're not as advanced or not as capable as extracting nutrients from food as animals are. But what we do have is a large brain, which can basically figure out how to get the nutrients from the food. And that's basically where we're at. And like, it's so true. Whatever you put in your mouth, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get all of the nutrition from that. There are certain things that you have to do, use our brains to, do modify the food in some way before we eat it so that we can extract the nutrients. So it just makes so much sense. And I can't wait to kind of get stuck into particulars about that. But what I did want to sort of bring up, first of all, is your book, because I've just been reading it. So again, late to the party. I know it's 2 years on since it was published, but I've been reading it, getting stuck in, loving it. I have to say, there are some parts that I find challenging, challenging for, I can imagine when people are reading it, they're just like, oh my God, like, is he really saying that about plants? Is he really saying that about meat? And I have to say, there's a part in particular that I'm intrigued to ask you about. It's about the meat. So when you say, look, us as humans, we're kind of detached from how we consume meat. So you're talking from the kill to the preparation, to the butchering, and then to the eating. And that part was just like, oh my gosh, like that, it was so triggering for me, because I was like, I can't even watch a nature program because they're so like, because they're attacking each other and they're killing each other. I'm like, oh, I can't take this. So it was triggering, but it was triggering because there's truth in it. Like, we've become so detached from what it means to be human, like what it means to eat and be human and to kind of survive. We just buy our meat from a supermarket and we have no idea where the meat came from, who did it, how it was killed. And you're right, there's got to be some sort of detachment there, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Like, there's got to be some sort of break.
Absolutely.
And I found that really interesting. What do you have to say about that? And also, you've got some stories in your book about how you would, how you'd be there when people would be, killing the animal. And how was that for you? Like, how was that process for you and your family as well?
Actually, I have a brand new story for you that wasn't in the book, and it happened
Yes.
2 weeks ago. So first off, you're 100% right. The connection that we're missing with our food today, I think, is the root of most of our problems. So one thing I like to say is we humans are the only species on the planet that hires people to tell us how we should be eating. Right? No other animal has to do that. The only other animals that should have some sort of are domesticated animals, because we've completely screwed them up the same way we've screwed ourselves up with diet. But as far as wild animals are concerned, no other animal asks somebody how they should be eating. They just intuitively do it, and it's a result of millions of years of evolutionary pressures and the resource availability, and they're changing body evolution through time, going hand in hand. It just works. For humans, what we started to do at 3.5 million years ago is separate ourselves. 3.5 million years ago was the point that I always mention, because it's at that moment that we created our first tool. And with that tool, we started out eating what our biological digestive tract could do, right? So with that tool, we started butchering animals, introducing meat into our diets, and then we eventually, things like fire and hunting technology and fermentation and all these other technologies we created, nixtamalization, drying, curing, all aging, all those things are technologies that increase nutrient density, make food safer, and make the nutrients more bioavailable to our bodies. When we started doing that, we no longer relied solely on our digestive tracts, and it's because of those technologies that we could create this influx of incredible nutrition that our, again, inefficient digestive tracts could make massive use of, and our bodies and brains could grow in response. And what's happened is we're now living in bodies that we no longer can support without the use of some sort of technology. We've replaced a lot of those technologies with things that are electric, like blenders and food processors and ovens and stoves. And those are more than just making our shakes in the morning look a certain way. They actually, when we're used properly, unlock nutrients in our food. But at each one of those steps, several things happen. One is we biologically change in response to the increased nutrition. And one thing before we dive down into this hole, I wanted to
Mhm.
mention something earlier that you mentioned about putting it into our mouths. There's every now and then I think you're probably the same way. You get this light, somebody says something and there's a light bulb moment. You're like, oh, that makes complete sense. And that happened to
Totally.
me.
Yeah.
It happens all the time, but one time it happened to me. I was reading Stephen Gundry's book, Plant Paradox, and I have all sorts of mixed feelings about that book. But one thing that I felt was brilliant was his description of where he described exactly what we talked about. When we have this misperception that when you put food into your mouth, it's going into your body.
Yeah.
And he says, no, it's like you go in, it's like you're driving from New Jersey to New York and you go into the Lincoln Tunnel under the Hudson River. When you go into the Lincoln Tunnel, you don't go into the Hudson River. You go in this tunnel under the Hudson River and you pop out in New York City. So when you put food in your mouth, it's the same kind of thing. It doesn't go in your body, it goes into a tunnel. And the only thing guaranteed is that it comes out the other end. It has all these other things have to be in place for your body to make use of the nutrients. One is your body has to be healthy and operating properly.
Yeah.
And the other is the food has to be broken down into the right state for our bodies to make use of it. If not, it's going to pass right through us. And there's tons of examples of how that happens. But back to your other point and this disconnection and connection. Up until the agricultural revolution, which occurs in different parts of the world between, beginning around 10 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was connected to their food, like visceral connection. If they weren't actively engaged in either the hunting or the butchering or the harvesting or the whatever, they at least saw it happening or were one person away from it, right? So nothing was hidden. It was just an incredible knowledge base, a traditional knowledge base that was continuously built and regurgitated over and over and over again until the agricultural revolution. At the agricultural revolution, many things changed. One of the things that changes is that a whole segment of the population was taken away from food acquisition and food processing. Right? And when we learn about it in schools, I remember learning about it in 8th grade, and Mr. Schumann would tell us about the agricultural revolution. And it was this amazing thing because, even though some people worked harder than ever to feed the rest of the population, so many people were freed up to become politicians and poets and musicians and all these other things. And there is value. There's wonderful things. Some of the most human things that we do are, the arts and that, expressing ourselves in those sorts of ways. But the negative consequence of that is that a whole segment of the population was taken away from a direct connection to their food. And this continues. And as agriculture intensifies, more and more people get removed because less people are working harder to produce more food. And there's also obviously all sorts of other issues with it from a dietary perspective and social stratification, all this. But at least as far as the connection is concerned, more and more people are getting disconnected from their food. And then the Industrial Revolution hits in the 1700s. And then we go from food producers to food consumers. Most people are not only not growing their food, but they're just literally purchasing it and are 3 or 4 or 5 links away in the food chain from where their food is actually coming from. And now we're sitting in a world where to even suggest an animal died. How weird is it that we sit down at a table and we're eating a piece of meat and we're not allowed to talk about the animal. In fact, it's like taboo. Oh my gosh, that's disgusting. Yeah. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it.
It would kind of kill the atmosphere if you said, I wonder how this animal died. Everyone would just stop talking. They'd be like, this is a weird conversation.
That's gross. Just let me eat my food. I don't want to think about it. And we find value in that insulation. But here's the problem. Several things are happening as we are turning our backs to what's actually happening. The industrialized meat system is out of control. I'm definitely not a vegan. I'm definitely not a vegetarian, but I can understand a lot of people being very upset with the way animals are being treated today.
I understand too. Yeah.
And the way that most meat is being produced today is not the way most meat has to be produced today. And the things that are happening to animals, the things that are happening in the food chain all the way to get to us, a lot of it is atrocious. And it happened because, in many ways, in part, because we're turning our backs to it and we're insulated. You just give me the chicken breast and I don't want to know anything else about it. And finally, now we're at a place, okay, now I want to know more about my chicken breast. Now I want to know more about this. But we're 2 or 3 or 4 generations removed, many of us, from anybody in our family that was raising animals or anybody in our family that was hunting. And so I think one of the biggest things that we can do, one of the best things that we can do is reconnect to, especially with animals, on the closest way that we possibly can. And it may be a small step. If all you do right now is eat chicken breast from an industrially produced chicken, go buy a chicken. Like go buy a whole chicken from the grocery store and at least take it apart in your kitchen. If, one thing that we started doing years ago, and I have to be honest, my wife, when we got married, was a vegetarian, and she was a vegetarian for the first couple of years until she was pregnant with our second child, and she just started craving meat. I never pushed her. It is obviously a very individual decision. And now, we're splitting steak dinners, and I'll tell you, that's a prelude to the story I'm going to tell you in a second. But, that sort of paints the picture for, I started bringing in, I was hunting my entire life. I brought up our daughters really didn't want to hunt much, but our son did. We hunt all the time still. So we're always butchering animals outside and doing those sorts of things. But years ago, I started bringing in half a pig into the house, like literally into our kitchen home, laying a half a pig on the counter. And as a family, we started butchering it. In the beginning, my wife was like, whoa, like that doesn't happen in the kitchen. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, this is what should be happening in the kitchen. And we started doing it. Once she realized.
They were lucky it was already dead. Like you could have brought in a live one.
It was already cut in half.
This is how we do things, guys.
But there's no, if the animal's killed right, there's no blood. And in the butchering process. And she's looking at this and there's like no blood. And she's, I don't understand. I thought it's like in her mind, there was going to be blood all over the floor and it was going to look like a massacre, a horror movie. And it wasn't that at all. And when we started to do it repeatedly and she started to see what was happening and the whole family, there were several amazing benefits. Number one, we were getting these animals directly from the abattoir, who's getting them directly from the people who raise them. So that is great. And sometimes we're connecting directly with the farmer and then going to the abattoir, the person who kills it, right? So we at that point, we weren't killing our own animal, or our own pigs at least. A half of a local pig cost me about $150. By the time we've butchered it, it's worth about $700 or $800, which is, from an economic perspective, that's great. The other thing that's awesome is that we get to use the entire thing. We make pork rinds from the skins, we use the bones for bone broth, we make all the different parts of it. So there's a complete use of the animal, which is wonderful. And probably the most important thing is my kids see what looks like an animal. Half a pig looks like a pig. The head's on it, it's got the skin on it, it's got the feet on it, it's got the bones in it. They get to see that this was something that was once living. They get to hear a knife scrape against bone. They get to see skin. Sometimes, depending on how well it was scraped, they get to see hair. These are all things that we think, oh my gosh, I don't want that in my kitchen. We need that stuff in our kitchen. We need that stuff in our conscience, even when we're eating it. And what's awesome is the conversations at the table went from years ago, I just want to eat my pork chop, I don't want to hear about it, to, hey, this was the pig that from this farmer that we had on the table, and Alyssa helped you cut this, right? And that's the kind of conversations we should be having around the table. It's a respectful conversation, but it's one of connection, and that's what we definitely need to get back to.
Yeah. I think having the family involved is such a wonderful thing, like just to have everyone together, like having great conversations and, butchering the pig together. It kind of brings you together. So that's a part of food preparation that we're missing. Like we're missing that kind of connection that you have with other people in the process. So yeah, I have to say that part was the toughest part for me so far as I'm reading, but there's truth in it, and I understand why it needs to happen and changes need to happen in that sense.
Can I say one more thing very quickly? Two quick pieces. One is, I think context is huge. Painting the picture, getting the context right, making people feel safe and understanding what's happening is crucial to having any of it be successful. One thing that's fascinating here is we teach, I'm sitting in the Eastern Shore Food Lab, our teaching kitchen of our food lab. And we just finished a 2-day butchering class last weekend, nose-to-tail butchering class. Started on Friday night and went through Saturday. And when I started running these classes, it would almost always be 100% men, like almost always covered. This past several times we've had families come in, and most recently a quarter of the people there were women, which is great. Some came with their significant other, some came by themselves, and they just that's awesome. In fact, some of my favorite butchers in this country, Kay Cavanaugh, Ashley Van Houten, they who are female, and it's so wonderful to see that happening. But I'll give you the quick version of this, and we can talk about it more later if we have time. Just the power of context. So remember, Christina, my wife, was a vegetarian for years. She's eating a lot of meat now. We do a lot of organ meats. She's good with the butchering. the killing part is still, that part of the animal dying is still a little bit foreign to her, and I completely understand, and everybody experiences these things a little bit differently, and that's absolutely fine. We were in Sardinia doing research a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that we were there for was to learn how to make something called caio di capretto, which is the most basic form of cheese making in the world, and it literally is simple as you take an unweaned animal, usually a goat, in this case it's a goat, and it fills its stomach with milk, it drinks, and then you take the stomach out and hang it up. And it's literally all you have to do. At the end, the chymosin enzymes that coagulate the milk are produced in the stomach because it's unweaned. The milk is raw, it's fermenting, and literally 2 weeks later, you come back and eat them. But I wanted to try that cheese. I wanted to participate in the making of that cheese and learn all about it. But most importantly, I wanted to see what happened to the rest of the goat. And just as a quick side note, this was taking place in Villa Grande, Sardinia, the epicenter of the very first blue zone ever identified. And, if anybody's familiar with the blue zones, the suggestion is the high amount of vegetables, little amount of meat. First of all, we ate hardly any vegetables at all the entire time we were there. But not only did they eat high quality animal protein, but they ate the entire animal. I mean, it was one of the most beautiful examples of eating the entire animal. And it wasn't that this happens once a year. This kind of approach I'm going to explain happens on a regular basis. So this goat, it was skinned, and they sell the skins, tan the skins, whatever. So here you have the rest of the goat. The feet were cut off, and the gallbladder was taken out. Other than that, so the skin, which is sold, literally the feet and the gallbladder was the only part of this animal we didn't eat. I mean, every other part of this animal was eaten. And it was absolutely, I mean, from the small intestines, including the small intestinal contents, the spleen, the lungs, we literally ate all of it. And it was beautiful the way they did it. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But the reason I bring it up is because Christina was there filming the whole thing. She filmed the goat. She saw the goat alive. She saw the goat killed. She saw the goat skinned. She saw the goat completely taken apart. She saw all the pieces put back together, all the pieces cooked, and then she ate it and understood. Well, first of all, remember, this is we call her a recovering vegetarian.
Yeah.
Witnessed the kill, the taking apart, the cooking, and then still ate it. On top of that, she found value in it. And it was, if we just went into the street and killed a goat and cut it up, I mean, that's one thing. In fact, that's a crime. But doing this in the cultural context of this, well-rooted tradition, and the respect and the skill that was involved with all of it, that context created a completely different experience for her. And it wasn't like she's, I gotta just try. She was eating it. She was enjoying a nourishing meal that was made from this experience. And that context is what I think is so incredibly important.
Wow, the evolution of someone going from vegetarian, vegan to that is so valuable to, be able to develop in that way. And what an experience. It's such an awesome experience. And just touching on that, this is totally going off track from what I was going to ask, but we're on this topic and it's so freaking interesting. When it comes to the meat, and when it comes to the organ meats and all of the bits and bobs of the animal, the parts that people take out of the animal to then butcher and use the meat for, those parts are the most nutritious parts, like the liver, the heart, the lungs. Like, they have the most nutrition, and yet for them to be sold, they're the cheapest, and they're probably the hardest to get hold of. I mean, I live in Grand Cayman, and gosh, we can barely get hold of liver. It's mad. Like, I can barely find liver anywhere. And it's crazy how we've kind of discarded that side of things, and yet now we're just kind of focusing on the meat of the animal, which you say is the least nutritious part of the animal, yet we focus on that, and that's where we get our protein from animal protein.
Yeah, so a couple things to keep in mind. So first off, the meat is the most nutrient-dense food in the world compared to the plants, right? There's no plant or fruit in the world that can touch meat in its nutrient density and bioavailability, and frankly, safety. But as far as an animal is concerned, of the parts that you can derive nutrition from, I'm not talking like, a sirloin compared to the tooth of the animal, obviously, like of the parts you can eat, which, believe it or not, is upwards of 95 to 98% of it by weight you can derive nutrition from. The meat is probably the least nutrient dense. When we think about the blood, the fat, and the organs, that is so much more nutrient dense than the meat. And not only is it more dense of nutrients, it's more varied in the nutrients. Secondly, the it's more bioavailable, right? So eating, you can get a lot of nutrients from eating raw meat. You can get more nutrients from eating raw meat that's been sliced or chopped up, right? Mechanically broken down. You can get slightly even more nutrients from meat that's been broken down and slightly cooked, not overcooked, but slightly cooked. And this is the work of a guy from Harvard named Richard Wrangham, who's done some studies in these areas. Probably the most bioavailable meat on the planet. Way to prepare meat on the planet is to like a medium rare hamburger. So you've mechanically ground it up, and then you've cooked it just a little bit, and that is probably slightly more bioavailable than just eating a steak, for example, right? We have to do less work to get those nutrients. Not that a steak isn't amazing, but that's slightly better. But organs are different. Organs and fat and blood, you can eat those raw and get all the nutrients from it so incredibly easy. I'm not saying we have to eat them raw, but you can, which is amazing. We eat about half the animal by weight. But if you look at the grocery stores, the other half is blood, blood and organs and those sorts of things. And that part usually gets discarded or used for something else. Sometimes it's used for dog food. Many of our dogs are eating better than we are. And these, but when you look at, so by weight, we only eat about half of the animal in most cases. In the US, about 50% of a cow and about 55% of a pig actually make it onto the grocery store shelves. But the half of by weight that we're not eating represents well more than half the nutrition that animal could have provided.
Wow. So when it comes to food preparation and for bioavailability, organ meats and offal is the most bioavailable, whereas when it comes to the actual muscle meat, that requires some processing, like some sort of heat, some sort of, chopping or cutting or something, just to make it a bit more bioavailable. So that kind of slides into the next topic, which is basically what I was really wanted to talk about. And this is going on to 3 foods that we consume regularly and that we consider to be healthy. But you're saying, okay, they are if you prepare them properly. So I want to talk about plants, so like vegetables, obviously. We eat salad and we think, yeah, this is great, this is going straight in, I feel so angelical, but actually it might not necessarily actually be going into your body and being used. The next part is nuts, which I'm just like, oh my gosh, I need to know about that because I love nuts and I eat them every day. And then lastly, flour. So that's something I want to talk about. So if we have time, because I know that they're big topics. So let's start with plants, because basically when it comes to vegetables, we think we have a salad, we've got to fill our plate with, eat the rainbow, half your plate vegetables. It's what we're encouraged to eat. And, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the best thing or the best way to be eating it. So can you speak on vegetables and what's the deal? What's the deal with vegetables?
My good friend, Anthony Chafee.
No, I don't.
Oh,
I'll
you need
look
to
him
look
up
up
after
Anthony
though.
Chafee.
Yeah.
He's from Australia. He lives in, he's from the US, but he lives in Australia. He's got a great podcast. He's full carnivore. I mean, hardcore full carnivore.
Right.
The epitome of a nourishing human body.
Yeah.
And he's brilliant. He says, and I'll start it off by that. He says, plants are trying to kill you. Like all plants are trying to kill you. And that's a strong statement.
But it gets attention. People are like, why?
It gets
and then
attention.
Explain. Yeah.
And he's right at some level. So every single plant, and again, let me a little disclaimer here in the beginning. I eat plants. My whole family eats plants. We are not plant-based, obviously, and we're very selective, not only about what plants we eat, but just as importantly, how we process them. We just don't sit there and just, eat. But it's different than the way I used to think. I used to think that the healthiest part of the grocery store was in the produce section, and I literally in my mind, I was so hyper focused and concentrating on feeding myself right and trying to lose weight and trying to get healthy and that every time I walked through a grocery store aisle, I was almost over the top focused on what I was doing. but not in the produce section. Like I just had this image that that was the safest, healthiest place to be, and my brain just shut off. And I'm like, oh, all of this, it's like the Garden of Eden, and all of this is amazing, and some is good, and more is better. And I would just load my cart with vegetables. And then when I moved into a different section, my brain would switch back on to start thinking about food. First off, it's a very dangerous thing to do in general, but it turns out that one of the most dangerous places in the grocery store is the produce section. All plants on the planet produce toxins. They do. It is a known fact. Now, and the reason is because they have to protect themselves, and they can't move. So they're engaged in chemical warfare with the outside world. The part that I'd like to qualify a little bit from Dr. Chafee's statement is that some of those, even though all plants produce toxins, some of those toxins are so incredibly powerful that, you know, one bite of the plant and you're dead, or your liver and your kidneys shut down and you wish you were dead and you're on dialysis the rest of your life, you know, very big. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a whole lot of plants that if you eat them, the toxins are at such low levels that it's not a very big deal. There's also a whole lot of plants that, and this is one of my areas of research for the past 20 years, that we figured out how to process the toxins out of those plants and make them safe to eat. And this happens all over the world with different plants and different traditional and indigenous approaches to food. What's really dangerous are the ones that are in the middle. The ones, and it's finally one of them is getting a lot more attention. There are plants that have toxins that if you eat it, you don't die the next day. In fact, you might not even feel an issue, but those toxins build up in your body over time. And those, in my mind, are the really, really dangerous ones, because it's not till months or years later that you start feeling the effects of overconsumption of these plants. And then your mind is just like, no. I mean, if you ate a mushroom and threw up 2 hours later, like, I'm not going to eat that mushroom again. But if you're eating this thing and it's a regular part of your diet, you feel like you're being healthy. And then 5, 6, 7 years down the road, you start having all these issues. Like, it can't be that, because I've been eating it, you know, every day. And one of the biggest issues, you know, culprits of that are oxalates, which as far as plant toxins are concerned, I have never found any indigenous or traditional way, or even modern way, of getting rid or mitigating the effects of the oxalates in plants.
Can I just ask, which plants are we speaking about when it comes to oxalates? Just some examples.
Okay, so the largest, and unfortunately one of the biggest issues today is that a lot of the foods that we call superfoods are some of the most toxic ones as far as oxalates are concerned. So spinach, as far as greens are concerned, spinach and Swiss chard, beets, those are incredibly high in oxalates. Most nuts are very high in oxalates, and almonds are one of the worst. Almonds and pine nuts are two of the worst, highest level ones. Seeds, many seeds are incredibly bad. Sesame seeds and poppy seeds are off the charts, you know, very, very, very high. Yeah. And the problem, and I had a massive oxalate toxicity, and the reason was because I was eating massive amounts of almonds. Almonds were my go-to snack. You know, almonds, they're low in carbs, they have protein, they're easy to transport, and they're cheap enough now that I could go to the big box stores and buy bags of them, and every day I'd have a handful of nuts, handful of nuts. Yeah. And I had major issues from it. So plants have toxins, but one thing, and I know some people might be turning off in their heads right now, okay, I don't want to listen to this anymore. You know, here's another person talking about plants. Plants have nutrition. They do. The problem with that nutrition is that sometimes it's not worth eating that plant, or not worth eating that plant without processing it properly to get that nutrition. And a lot of times with plants, the plants don't give up that nutrition as easily. Right. So it's not, even though the nutrition's there, it's not bioavailable. It can pass right through our bodies. So we have to process the plants to make them safe, and to make sure that the nutrition it has is accessible to our bodies. And there's a lot of ways to do this depending on the plant and the toxin and the nutrient we're looking for. So a great example, you know, one of the big go-tos is fermentation. Fermentation is an amazing way to detoxify certain plants, and also to unlock the nutrients so our body has access to them with less work. Another great example, I don't know if we have time to dive into it, I treat it at length in the book, but we can talk about it if we have time, is maize or corn. Corn is one of the most difficult grains for the human body to digest. And I don't care if you grind it up in a cornmeal, cook it in the corn, it doesn't matter. A lot of the nutrition passes directly through our body. There's only one
quite
way.
literally.
Quite literally, many of
Funny.
us have seen
Like,
the effects
obviously.
of that. There's one traditional way
Something,
of
yeah.
approaching maize called nixtamalization. It's at least 4,000 years old. That is the only way to allow access to all the nutrients in maize to our bodies. So, excuse me, vegetables, plants in general, create toxins. A quick little way of just maybe visualizing this to understand, certainly, and I know so many people are like, oh man, I'm thinking about this, and I'm so worried about my carbs, and I'm worried about my macros and my micros, and I got one more thing to worry about. Yeah, you do, and it's worth worrying about. But a general way of a framework of thinking about plants and toxins is this: plants don't want to get eaten. In fact, plants aren't evil because they care about being evil, right? Or it takes energy to create these sorts of toxins. So they just don't create them to create them. They create them to protect themselves so they can reproduce viable offspring. They can reproduce viable offspring, and they don't become extinct. The toxins they're creating are there to protect them against fungus, disease, predators, all those sorts of things, right? So one way to think about this is, if the role of the plant is to protect themselves against all those sorts of things, what parts of the plant have the most amount of toxins? So for plants that put a lot of energy underground and use that energy to live over the year, like through the winter, and things like potatoes, for example, things that underground storage organs like that, where they spend all spring and summer creating all this starch, it's filled up in the potato or the plant that's like that. Then the top of it dies off over the winter, and it's feeding off of itself all winter. So the most important part of that plant is the starch-rich underground storage organ, right? And then spring comes, new plant, photosynthesis. You can imagine that most of the toxins are underground in that part of the plant, and it's on the skin. Most of them are on the skin. So anybody who told you that potato skins are the most healthy part of a potato, it's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, they're not. They don't have the most amount of nutrition, but even if they did, it's not worth it, because that's where most of the toxins are.
Yeah.
So that's that. Stalks and leaves, certainly at varying different times of the year, different plants can have all sorts of toxins in there, because obviously they don't want those parts to go away. But to sort of segue into your next part of your question with grains and nuts and things, the grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes, those are the babies of the plant. You can imagine that a plant is doing everything it can to protect its offspring, its progeny, and that's true. So grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes are often incredibly toxic, and that's there to protect themselves. And we'll get back to that in 1 second. But there's two parts of the plant that the plants put a lot of energy into attracting instead of pushing away, and that's the flower and the fruit. Flowers, the flowers are beautiful. Flowers smell good. Flowers taste good, because they're trying to attract pollinators. So it's very rare. It's not never, but it's very rare that a flower is going to be toxic, or if it is, it's not going to have a high level of toxin. But we don't eat a lot of flowers, so it's not a very big deal. But fruit is. Fruit is generally, when fruit is ripe, when the seeds are mature, fruit is generally there to attract another animal to eat the fruit, take the seeds in, and the seeds, which are physically and chemically designed to withstand our digestive tract, then get deposited in a pile of manure somewhere else, and the whole system works really, really, really well. But quick little side note, as far as fruits are concerned, there are many examples of when a plant fruit is incredibly toxic. In some cases, will kill you toxic until the seeds are mature, because they don't want those seeds to get eaten too early. There's a wild plant here that grows called Mayapple, that you will die if you eat that fruit until it's ripe. And then when it's ripe, it kind of shuts that off, because it wants to attract, but it doesn't want to do it too early. Here's the crazy part: the seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes are chemically and physically designed to withstand our digestive tract, and in some cases will not even germinate until they've gone through the digestive tract of a mammal, right? In certain cases. But what do? We actually take these seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes that are physically and chemically designed to withstand our digestive tract and try to get nutrition from it. Yeah. I mean, that's literally what a loaf of bread is, right? Yeah. And that's what a nut is. And if we're going to do that, we have to do things to it. So the outside of the grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes are often the most toxic part. And it's there because, again, it's resisting disease and it's laying dormant and all these things until it's in the right environment to create new life. The very things that are protecting the seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes have to get shut off, many of them, for that plant to sprout, right? So one of the ways to help detoxify or deal with a lot of the toxins or problems with grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes is to trick it into thinking it's in that environment to support new life. So things like soaking and sprouting and fermenting are great ways of mitigating a lot of the issues with the toxins that are on the outside and sometimes on the inside of those grains as well. So here at home and also here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, our restaurant, every single nut that we use, there's some we will never use. We will never use pine nuts. We will never use almonds. They're just too high on that oxalate, too high levels of oxalates that we can't process out. But we always soak all of our nuts. We soak all of our nuts, then we dehydrate all of our nuts, and then we do whatever we're going to do with it, like make peanut butter or whatever we're going to do. Any wheat goes through a long, wild, slow fermentation process. So it's anything made with wheat in it at all is completely through the sourdough process. Yeah. Any maize that we have, we nixtamalize. And again, I know for many people, this is like, oh my gosh, this is overload. I don't want to think about this right now. I am here to tell you that our entire family has been raised on doing all of that in our home. And now, and if you think it's not possible to do, we're doing it at a commercial level. Now we have a restaurant where all the food we produce has been done that way, or is continuously done that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And just when you said that we need to kind of fool seeds, nuts, legumes, we need to fool them into thinking that they're in an environment where they can sprout and thrive. Gosh, that was a bit of a kind of truth bomb for me. I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like, put them in an environment. That's why, fermenting and soaking that's why they're so good, because it's almost like the seed kind of drops its defenses and it's like, oh, okay, like now I can relax, and now I can be like, and that's when you can get the nutrition from it. So that makes so much sense. But going back to vegetables just quickly, when you said that spinach and you were mentioning some vegetables that people eat every single day and see as a health food. I mean, we put them raw into our smoothies. We've had them for salads, and it's mental to think that, gosh, like we could be getting nothing from that nutritionally.
You're actually getting, I can tell, and this is going to be a strong statement, but I wholeheartedly believe it, and partially because I've experienced it. Not only could you not be getting nutrition from it, you're actually harming yourself, especially if it's a high oxalate
from
food.
You. Yes.
It's robbing nutrients from you. But let me stay on this oxalate thing for 1 second, since you brought up the spinach again. Two things I want to mention. First off, let me explain what it is. So under a microscope, oxalates look like little tiny shards of glass, and they're very sturdy. And when our body can deal with a limited amount every single day that we can process out, or we can get rid of. But anything beyond that, our body realizes how incredibly dangerous these things are. They're like little tiny razor blades that we're swallowing, and they take them and they put them in different places in our bodies where they kind of can just store them. Typically, this is happening, so listen, I am not trying to sell anybody anything. I don't even know of an anecdote for oxalate issues. What I'm going to suggest, if you are suffering from any of the things that I'm mentioning, all I'm suggesting is you can look into it a little deeper and consider removing, even temporarily, high oxalate foods in your diet and see if you have an effect. I mean, if anything, it's a free way to start to feel better, right? So just bear with me for a minute.
Yeah.
Because some of this is going to sound strange, especially when I'm attacking
I really want to know
almonds
this, by the
way.
Like, because I eat a lot of almonds, I eat a lot of nuts and spinach, so I need to know this. Yeah.
Okay, so when you consume more of this than your body can handle, your body takes it and puts it in places, often at your extremities. So in your feet, in your hands, in your limbs, in your joints. If you've had an area that's experienced some kind of trauma, like you've injured your shoulder or you've injured your neck, a lot of times these can get deposited in those areas. Corneas are a place they typically get deposited. So, and obviously in organ tissue as well. Symptoms of issues related to oxalates. First off, an obvious one is kidney stones, right? So kidney stones are almost always a result of oxalates. Another thing that is often a result of high oxalate or oxalate toxicity is gout. Now, gout, there's 4 things that cause gout. The only one that we talk about is uric acid. but quite often it's a result of an oxalate toxicity, calcium oxalate that's doing it. And one of the biggest issues is if you go into your doctor, man, my foot's bothering me. They're like, you have gout, and they don't give you a uric acid test. And it's because of oxalate toxicity. What do they tell you to do? Stop eating meat and start eating vegetables. Eat high vegetable diet. It's the worst. It's actually the opposite of what you should be doing if you have gout result of that. One of the things, and I like to talk about this all the time, wild animals live these incredible lives and then keel over dead. And that's exactly how I want to die. That's exactly how I want to live, and then I want to die. I want to live this incredible life and then just keel over dead.
Right.
What we've done, because, and in part, in total because of lifestyle, but in part because of diet, we have normalized, because it's now normal, to die the last 20 or 30 years of our life, this very slow death. And we've normalized, joint pain at 35 years old. You walk up the steps and my knees are starting to creak. Oh, that's normal because I'm 35. Or you're 50 years old and your feet are swollen and you get out of bed and your ankles hurt a little bit until you move around. That's not normal. Right. It is normal because we're all seeing it because it's happening, but it's mainstream, but it shouldn't be normal. And a lot of those sorts of things, joint pain, aching, inflammation, all of that are symptoms potentially of oxalate toxicity. I've had a lot of these things happen, and again, this is a much longer than we have time for, but any not undiagnosed, things that, many of us have had this. We go to the doctor and we're like, I got this pain, doc, I got this pain. And they look at you and maybe they even give you an MRI or a CAT scan. I'm like, oh no, that everything's fine. But, and then you start to feel silly. You're like, maybe I'm just making up in my head, but you feel it and feel it and feel it.
I think most people get that. Most people get that often.
They get that at some level, right?
We all do.
Anything that I've ever had like that has gone away completely when I reduce the oxalates in my diet, completely.
Wow.
And I do want to say a couple things. So again, almonds, nuts in general, but almonds and pine nuts are huge. Spinach, Swiss chard, sesame seeds, poppy seeds. Sesame seeds are a big one for a lot of people because they're eating tahini, right? Tahini is nothing but sesame seeds. If you're eating a lot of these high oxalate foods and you're experiencing these sorts of things, at least all that I'm suggesting is you look into it a little bit deeper. And the best source right now that I know of is a woman named Sally Norton. She just came out with a book in February called Toxic Superfoods.
Right.
She's wonderful. She's full of information. Her website is full of a bunch of free information, and her book is absolutely fantastic. And it will, and so one thing to consider is if you have had a high oxalate diet for a very long period of time, long enough to start experiencing a lot of these symptoms, one thing to be aware of is if you cut oxalates out of your diet, typically your body feels better very quickly. If that's the issue, a lot of times your body feels better within just a couple of weeks. But for some people, especially people that have a lot of oxalate toxicity, it's a temporary feeling because all of a sudden your body's like, oh, good, I'm not getting any more of these, and you feel great. And a lot of times your symptoms completely go away. And then when your body realizes you're not consuming these, it starts to dump the oxalates that it's had stored up.
Right.
And it can get very painful, and in some cases can get dangerous. So the reason I'm mentioning her book and also her website is there's a lot of information there that, okay, if you've realized this may be an issue, there's a safe way to start weaning. It's not, don't go cold turkey. There's a way to start weaning yourself off these things. But for many of us, what is he talking about? Like spinach? Yes, it's true. It's true. Think about this. First off, how she says it all the time. How crazy is it that we base one of the most, we call something a superfood, and it's become dietary mainstream because of a cartoon. Like it literally is because of a cartoon that we think spinach is so incredibly healthy. If you're still on the fence as to whether or not you should be getting up every morning and having a spinach shake and eating a spinach salad for lunch. So first of all, a single spinach salad, depending on the size of it, can be 4 times the amount of oxalates that you should take in for the day. Just one spinach salad. And I know people that are eating spinach twice a day, every single day. Mm-hmm. If you're coming from that mindset that, oh wait, that's normal because all the dietitians are saying we should eat all the spinach. Think about this, and let's put it from another perspective. So I'm coming from sort of more ancestral, sort of evolutionary lens. There is no plant anybody in the world could consume as a hunter-gatherer every day of the year. Like it just wasn't available. There's no plants that everybody consumes. So is spinach bad? No. spinach every day is bad. Is spinach bad if you ate the spinach the 2 weeks out of the year it would grow in your area? No, it's absolutely fine. Even if you got a whole bunch of oxalates for 2 weeks, then the other 50 whatever weeks of the year, you wouldn't be getting all those oxalates of spinach, and it would be fine. Mm. But now we can ship it. We've called it a superfood. We have all these dietitians talking about it. We can get it in the grocery store every single day. And now we've normalized eating spinach every day. And now it seems abnormal to not. Think about nuts. I remember growing up, Christmas Eve, we'd go to my grandparents' house, and on the table, or a family's house, sometimes grandparents, sometimes my uncle, and they would have a bowl of nuts with the shell and a nutcracker. And I would spend hours cracking the nuts. And I think by the end of the night, I had a handful of nuts and I eat them. And that was what I had for the year. Like now they're getting, if I said to you, go find an almond tree, collect all the nuts, crack open all the nuts, and then eat all the nuts, you would never eat the amount of nuts that you eat today, because we can now go to the grocery. At least over the past several decades, shelled nuts were so expensive. The limiting factor there wasn't time to crack them open. Nobody could afford to buy a big bag of nuts and eat them every day. But now Costco or the big box stores, you can buy a big bag of almonds for shelled almonds for $10, and you can eat as many as you want, and we don't even feel it. It is weird, and that's part of the connection, right? If we're connected to the land, we're connected to seasonality, we're connected to how food has to be processed, then a lot of these things answer themselves very easily. Another quick side note, not to get off topic, but I don't mean to just bash plants. Let's talk about organ meats for just 1 second, because we're so disconnected. One of the questions I get all the time is, okay, how much liver should I eat every day? Like, if liver is so amazing, and it is amazing, how much should I eat every day? And some of this comes from, there's a lot of people on social media now saying that we should eat like 10 pounds of liver and raw bull testicles and all this crazy stuff every day, which is as ridiculous as eating just chicken breast every day, right? That question is a question our ancestors never had to ask. Like, if I went to a hunter-gatherer and they just killed an animal and they're dragging it back to camp, and I said, how much liver should you eat today? And they would look at it and say, that much. And I'm going to eat the spleen and the heart and the kidney, and then I'm going to eat all the meat, and then I'm going to go kill another animal. I don't understand the question. But now we other people take animals.
We're so departed from that way of thinking. It's crazy. Like, when you say it, it's like, oh my God, we're so distanced from that.
Right. So that is where I do think a lot of the questions, things we've talked about today, questions that people have, a lot of these things we can answer ourselves just by reconnecting. Like, if you start growing some food, you understand seasonality with spinach. You start shelling your own nuts, you understand how hard work that is. And it puts things all back into perspective.